Alright everybody, here's the deal. We're back with another episode of Outlandish, and I'm particularly obsessed with this one, and we're going into the rabbit hole. We're going to talk about how I have a particular theory that Excalibur, King Arthur's Excalibur, was actually a weapon from space. Okay, so before I get into all of that, I want to let you guys know that King Arthur is a definite special interest of mine. I've been obsessed with the Arthurian legend as long as I can remember, and I've spent an unholy number of hours researching it. So before we get any further down this rabbit hole, before we talk about Arthurian legend and Excalibur, and we clear up all of the historical notes about languages and everything like that, I just want to say one thing. There is no Arthurian canon. Right? We're used to canon. We're used to Star Wars canon, Marvel canon. We're used to canon being what happens in a story and the non-canonical things aren't in the story. Old myths and legends didn't work like that. Old folklore didn't work like that. The people who wrote myths and legends in the distant past weren't concerned with those sorts of things. And we see that all through the ancient world, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the works of Homer like the Iliad and the Odyssey, Native American legend, Japanese and African mythology, and even American folklore in the modern era. The idea of a canonical intellectual property is extremely new. And back in the day, it was kind of whoever told the best story about the beloved character became the most popular. And because we're kind of tuned into looking for canon, people will argue about what's the actual legit Arthurian legend. When in reality, there's no such thing. Even in the earliest days of the legends of a potential historical Arthur, it was just scrambled up with ambiguity in the mists of history. So no, there is no Arthurian canon. There's more of an Arthurian multiverse, and I want you to keep that in mind as we discuss these myths and legends. And no, what this video is not going to do is give you a whole comprehensive history of King Arthur. If so, it would be a 6-parter video with every single ounce of historical and anthropological and archaeological knowledge. And I would love to do a video like that in the future, so if this one does well and you guys want to, maybe we'll look into it. But it should be known that actually modernly most historians think that King Arthur was not real, that he actually never really existed in real life. We have all these competing theories of like who inspired Arthur and where did the legend come from, but the general consensus is that he is just mostly a legend. I don't personally believe that, and I have my reasons for it, but you should know historically that's the world that we're diving into. What you should know is that these legends aren't medieval. They aren't from the 13 and 1400s. That was when a lot of them were written down, but the actual Arthur legends come from the 5th or 6th century. So the years 400 or 500 AD or CE. This was in post-Romano Britain, when the Romans had left Britain, and there were other groups invading like the Vikings and specifically the Anglo-Saxon. And the British people, who were a mix of Roman descendants and native British people, all came together and repelled these invaders. And we can see historically that actually between the years of 500 and 550, the Anglo-Saxons actually were repulsed from Britain. Something fought them off. And that's King Arthur's main story. He unites all of Britain together to face these invaders. Now, just to go really quick through a lot of Arthur stuff, a lot of people say it comes from the Roman name Artorius, which is a family name. That name probably actually came from a Celtic last name, Artorigios, which itself came from an even older Celtic name, Artorigios, which means son of the bear king or son of the warrior king, since bear and warrior were interchangeable terms at the time. This is also where we get the old Irish personal name Artri, which we would translate as Arthur later on. But there's actually a lot of evidence that Artorius was not where King Arthur's name came from, because even in the early Latin manuscripts, it was never Artorius, it was Arturus, which doesn't sound like a big difference, but linguistically it is. There's also the theory that it came from 2 Welsh words, Art and Gwir. Arth means bear and Gwir means man, so Arth Gwir would be bear man. But Arthur was specifically always rhymed, even in the Welsh text, with words that ended in UR, and not Gwir like you would expect if this was the etymology. So that one's probably also not true. There's another theory that his name came from Arcturus, which is the brightest star in the constellation Bootes, which is near Ursa Major, or the Great Bear. In reality, we have no idea. There's not a single archaeologist, not a single etymologist, or a single historian who knows for sure where the legend or the name of King Arthur came from. Some people think that he was never a person at all, but he was actually a Welsh folk hero or even god that was changed into a person when Christianity came. That was something that Christianity often did in Ireland and England and Scotland. They took gods from legends and turned them into heroes and kings of the past. The most likely explanation is that he was a local tribal leader. And in fact, in the earliest mentions of King Arthur, he was never called a king at all. The earliest authentic historical mention of King Arthur actually calls him Dux Bellorum. That means leader of battles. It paints Arthur as more of a military leader than a king anyway. This comes from the Historia Bretonum. It's a 9th century Latin historical compilation. and most people later on thought that it was written by a Welsh cleric named Nennius. This is the very first datable mention of King Arthur. It lists 12 battles that he fought, including the Battle of Badon, in which he is said to have single-handedly killed 960 men. Now, we say the first datable mention because there are older records that mention King Arthur, but we haven't found a manuscript that dates to that time. We found later copies, and so historians say that they could have been altered even though they're supposed to date from before. For example, Y Gododdin is an epic Welsh poem which was written by the poet Aneirin, who lived in the 6th century. Now, though this dates earlier, the manuscripts we have are copies of other ones, but this would have been the earliest mention of Arthur chronically. And in fact, what's really interesting about this mention is it literally says that there was a hero and that this hero was great and grand and amazing and did amazing deeds, but he was no Arthur. Kind of hinting at the fact that King Arthur was a famous figure at the time. And again, because we can't date that exact piece of paper, we have to go with the 9th century one that we can date. There's also the fact that we have older manuscripts that don't mention King Arthur, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that was written between 400 and 820. He's also absent from St. Bede's early manuscript that was written in the 8th century, called the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And you would think that they would have written about him. And all of this kind of goes together to my theory, where I think there was a historical Arthur, and I think that his name was kind of erased from history after Mordred killed him, but we can get into that in another video because we're not talking about that, we're talking about Excalibur, and swords are cool. But we'll come back to all the historical stuff later. Because Arthur didn't stay a Dux Bellorum, he became something so much bigger, the grand leader of this entire nation in our legends and myths and histories. And mostly for this rise in popularity, we can thank Geoffrey of Monmouth. He was a Welsh chronicler that wrote the Historia Regium Britanniae, and this was in the year 1138. This exploded the myth of King Arthur all over the world and inspired so many other cultures to write things about him and his Knights of the Round Table and the Holy Grail and Camelot, and most importantly, his magic sword. Excalibur, Cali boy, the one, the edge, it's a slicey thing, it slices, it cuts through everything. Magic, slicey, cutty boy. That's what we all know. We've seen it in movies, we've read about it in books. The magic sword, the end all magic sword that makes you a king, that gives you powers, that just, it's unbeatable. It is literally the OPest of the OP goated weapons in all of human history. That's how it's kind of painted in modern popular culture. The reality is there's a lot of confusion surrounding Excalibur. Most of this is because of that multiverse stuff we were talking. There were hundreds of authors over thousands of years who all made their own stories about King Arthur, and we have all of those to pull from. So I'm going to tell you a short literary history of Excalibur and where the legend comes from. So Excalibur itself, the word, originally comes from the Welsh name for the sword, which is Cadwulc. Cadwulc means hard cleft, or essentially the ability to slice through anything. Now, this could have just been the name of a sword in general in Proto-Welsh, but all we know is that name gave rise to all the names of this sword later on. When Geoffrey of Monmouth came along, he called Cadwulc Caliburnus. He said that it was forged on the Isle of Avalon, the magical, mystical island of people with immense power and a connection to the other world and the Fae. He describes it as an insanely powerful weapon, but he doesn't say anything about it being the right to rule, that it giving the authority to be king. And he also doesn't say where it came from. In fact, we would have to wait a long time until we found out those facts. And who of all people would give it to us? The French. Specifically, Robert de Boron, or Boron, or however it is pronounced in French. This was in the late 12th century, and he wrote a poem called Merlin. In this story, Arthur proves his right to rule by pulling the sword from an anvil in a stone in a churchyard in England. Now, this sword was magical and it represented his kingship, but it was not yet called Excalibur. In fact, the French wouldn't come up with the name Excalibur until they had already gone through Caliburn, Calibrum, and Calibrune. However the French would say that, I don't even know. A French person can please help us out in the comments. And if you're looking for when that name first arose, Excalibur, it came from the early 13th century. This is the time when the sword and the stone and Excalibur were linked together for the very first time. That name in its final form and that sword were one and the same. So you're asking yourself, where does the Lady of the Lake come in? Well, we have to wait to the mid-13th century for that. This is something called the post-Vulgate cycle. In this story, a mystical, fairy-like Lady of the Lake, a sacred woman associated with his body of water, gifts this sword to Arthur. This new sword was also called Excalibur, and there's actually a reason for this. There was this division between the Vulgate cycle in the early 13th century and the post-Vulgate cycle after the 13th century. And there was a change in how they told the story. The earlier ones focused more on Merlin and more on the Christianity and more on the divine side of things. And the post-Vulgate writers wanted to focus more on the magic and enchantment. So they maybe used the Lady of the Lake and emphasized her role in the story and kind of de-emphasized the role of Merlin and those sorts of elements. So we had these two distinct legends of where Excalibur came from up until the 15th century. In 1485, Thomas Malory wrote Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of King Arthur, one of the most famous stories associated with the Arthurian myth. This story combines both versions of the Excalibur story. Arthur first pulls a magical sword from a stone to become king, but then after this first sword is broken in battle, he goes to the Lady of the Lake and she gives him Excalibur. This version solidifies a two-sword tradition, which then was picked up and used in a lot of other writers' works. So originally, Robert de Boron made it a kingship test, the post-Vulgate cycle turned it into a magical lake sword, and Malory just tied it all together. This is important to see these sorts of things and how history works together. Again, we have our minds that are tuned into the canon to be like, well, what's the actual story? There is no one story. There are a lot of different stories inspired by even more texts. For example, Geoffrey of Monmouth said that he had a lot of original Welsh texts, ancient texts, that he used to create the Historia Regum Britanniae. Most modern historians think he just made that up and that there were no texts. I think that there's some pretty good historical evidence that those texts did exist and that he was working with a lot of source material. But unfortunately, most of what has been written and most records have been lost. We actually only have a tiny, tiny slice of what has been created in the past. And most of the legends have disappeared or been intentionally erased. That is something that is always important, is we have this sort of present bias towards the past because we only have the historical things that happened to survive, not everything that was created, not even close. Now, instead of that being a sad thing, I think it's a wonderful breeding ground for the legends of King Arthur. It means that you can have full leeway to use this legend however you would want to, if you were creating an Arthurian story. And you can come up with your own hypotheses about King Arthur, the Round Table, the Sword and the Stone, Excalibur, and it just so happens that I have done just that. In 1978, there was a book written by Anne C. Thomas and C. Scott Littleton. It's called The Sarmatian Connection, New Light on the Origin of the Arthurian and Holy Grail Legends. This hypothesis suggests that the King Arthur legend was inspired by Iranian Sarmatian cavalry who were stationed in Britain and served under Roman leaders. And this happened in the year 175. Marcus Aurelius sent 5,500 Sarmatian heavy cavalry to Britain to support the war effort, and they served under Roman leaders who were defending the frontier. This theory is the main inspiration for the 2004 King Arthur movie. It takes a more historical approach where King Arthur is a Romano-British leader who's leading these Sarmatians after the fall of the Roman Empire and kind of uniting Britain. And these Sarmatians are his knights of the Round Table. Now, the Sarmatians are closely related to the Scythians, and they had a lot of interesting spiritual customs. For example, they had powerful priestesses and female shamans who usually lived near bodies of water, and they were associated with these bodies of water. In the 5th century, Herodotus calls them the Enaries. These women had prophetic powers and they were associated with water-based rituals. They also had an interesting custom involving swords. It was a sacred act to honor their war god, but also symbolized oaths, kingship, and divine favor. This act was driving a sword into the earth. This could have influenced the sword and the stone motif, especially the idea of removing something and becoming king because of it. If Sarmatian cavalry settled in Britain after the Roman Empire fell, their customs and religious beliefs could have melded together with the indigenous Celtic ones of the time. And blending in Roman and Christian traditions into all that, we have a very fertile ground for myths and legends to grow from. And in fact, this is where my theory comes in. If there was a historical Arthur, I see him less as a product of all of these things and more of an instigator. And I mean, this could be totally fake, totally not real, but imagine this. Arthur is born into this world with old Roman customs and Sarmatian and Scythian customs and the ancient Celtic ones, and Christianity is a brand new thing. And he combines them all, the sacred beliefs of all cultures, to create a cohesive British identity. This blending of Roman, Sarmatian, Celtic, and British traditions could explain why Arthur is depicted as a warrior king with a divine sword chosen by fate, a leader of both native Britons and Roman-trained foreign knights. And I don't know if any of that's true, but I think it's literally the coolest thing I could ever think of. And the idea of super weapons, of enormously powerful implements of war, appear in pretty much every single culture across the entire history of the entire world. You have Gramir and Gugnir from Norse mythology, Lugspear and Cleave Shalish from Irish mythology, the Kusanagi no Tsurugi from Japanese mythology, the Hindu Vijaya bow and Gandiva, and many, many more. We are obsessed with the idea of weapons that are unstoppable. Weapons that can just destroy and slice through anything, that can help you become an unbeatable hero. And it's probably because of a deep ancestral knowledge. In the history of humankind, technology has accelerated at certain points astronomically. The Bronze Age came to replace stone. The Iron Age came to wipe away the Bronze Age. And then after all of that, steel, a technology that cannot be understated. If you were a Stone Age or Bronze Age society, steel would seem like a super weapon. Steel would seem like something that could cut through literally anything, that would stay sharp forever. And that could have been preserved and handed down to us in all of these myths and legends. One of these examples is the sword of Attila the Hun. This was a mythical weapon. According to the legend, Attila literally wielded the sword of the war god. They call it the sword of Mars because later Roman sources kind of combined the war god with Mars, who was their war god. But for Attila's people, the Huns, it was the sword of the god of war. This sword was supposedly found when a farmer approached Attila and said that he had noticed one of his sheep or cows had been injured in the leg. When he followed the path of blood, he found an ancient sword sticking up out of the ground. Well, he brought this sword to Attila, and Attila saw it as his divine right to conquer the world. And he did. Up until his untimely death in the year 453, Attila had conquered the known planet, and he attributed it to this amazing weapon. And no one knows where this sword went, whether it was buried with Attila, whether it was stolen by one of his generals or his sons. His empire crumbled and broke apart, and it turned into a massive civil war and sort of an apocalyptic time for the Huns and for the world at large. There's no knowing what happened to that item eventually, because the society broke apart and joined the other resident nomadic tribes of the area. But one interesting thing I want to touch on is a legend about this sword of Attila. And that legend is that the sword had come from the heavens. Space, the final frontier, the big ol' last area that we have to explore as humans, the unknown of the unknown of the unknown. It has always enchanted us. Thinking about what's out there beyond, past the stars, has always captivated our imagination. And because of that, it's not only influenced our myths and legends, but it has influenced the way that we see things that come from outer space. In 1925, an archaeologist by the name of Howard Carter uncovered a very interesting artifact. It was a dagger found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun, or King Tut. It was one of two daggers actually wrapped up with the mummy, meaning it was of extreme importance. This one specifically stood out because of its extraordinary craftsmanship and unique metal composition. It was a meteor. The knife that King Tut had was crafted, forged out of a stone that fell from space, gifted to Egypt by the gods. In 2016, scientists confirmed that the iron dagger's blade was made from meteoric iron. It had a very high nickel and cobalt content, two metals that the ancient Egyptians did not have the technology to melt or work with in their natural form. The composition matched other local meteorites, which goes to show that this dagger was made out of a fallen space rock. It was likely sourced from one of several iron-rich meteorites that had fallen in Egypt, such as the Camille Crater meteorite. They called this iron from the sky, Bianpet, and they saw it as a gift from the gods. The Egyptians rarely worked in iron and were mostly a Bronze Age culture. Scholars think that the ancient Egyptians didn't just think this dagger was special, but they saw it as literally an implement of the gods, given to Pharaoh to recognize his godhood. And the Egyptians were not the only culture that saw meteors as sacred. The Japanese called it tenkagane, heavenly iron. Some mythological katanas were thought to be forged from meteoric iron and were thought to have amazing properties because of it. The Iron Pillar of Delhi in India, though not made from meteoric iron, is, as a lot of historians suggest, maybe the product of knowing how to work with iron because the ancient peoples had worked on meteors, or learned that way. In Rome, they believed that falling stars foretold the death of emperors, or major political events. In the 14th century BC, Uhaziti was the king of Arzawa. This was a rival kingdom to the Hittites. During a conflict with the king Mursuli II, a meteorite allegedly struck the city of Apasa. This was Arzawa's capital. This meteor actually injured or killed Uhaziti, the king. Mursuli II took advantage of this and overcame Arzawa. And this is the very first time that we have the record of a meteor influencing the outcome of a battle or conquest. In China, they were seen as symbols of cosmic imbalance, often as a warning against a corrupt ruler. The Aztec and the Maya saw them as omens of war or conquest or even the arrival of gods on Earth. And even modernly, if you've heard of the Tunguska event in 1908, some of the indigenous Evenki tribes saw this as a punishment from the gods. The most sacred site in Islam, the Kaaba, which is at the center of the Great Mosque of Mecca, has set in its corner the black stone, which supposedly fell from the heavens. Certain Buddhist relics were also said to have fallen from the heavens. These represented divine wisdom and were called sky stones. And in medieval times, some meteorites were kept in Christian churches. They were seen as relics or even ground into power and were said to have magical or medicinal purposes. In the Bible, there is a record of a holy meteorite, or at least that's what most scholars think. In Acts 19:35, there's a city official of the city of Ephesus, and he's addressing a crowd. The Christian missionaries had told the populace that they can't worship their old gods. And this man says, "Men of Ephesus, does not all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image that fell from the heavens?" This suggests that at the Temple of Artemis, one of the ancient seven wonders of the world, their central cult image was actually made out of a meteorite. This likely would have remained there until it was sacked by the Goths in the year 262. So all of this historical evidence points at the fact that humankind has a couple of obsessions, and these obsessions include swords, rituals associated with swords, and kingship, and divine favor, and gods of war. That these swords are combined with the idea of coming from the heavens, and that these meteors coming from the heavens become objects of immense power, that they are the will of the gods to give us weapons to help overcome and conquer and build kingdoms and unite people. But see, if that were the only argument, my theory would fall flat. I could cherry pick things from history and tell you, yes, humans generally do these things and they're generally obsessed with these things, so therefore King Arthur's Excalibur was obviously a meteorite. But I didn't give you any evidence for that. Or did I? Because if you were listening closely, you may be caught throughout this entire video that there was one stream, a narrative that went through the entire thing. When the king of Arzawa, Uhaziti, was killed in 1320 in the city of Apasa, you probably didn't know that that city, Apasa, later became the city Ephesus. Yes, the very same city in which there was a sacred meteor. The city in which a meteor killed a king happened to be later a city in which a meteor was worshipped as coming from the gods. And when that city was sacked by the Goths in 262, I didn't tell you that those Goths were master metalsmiths who were pioneers in iron metallurgy and who likely would have used other legends and the dependence on other legends to turn something that came from space from the gods into a weapon from the gods. Well, these tribes of Huns are hard to track and have been dispersed, but the area that they lived natively happened to also be the area that Attila the Hun is from, where about 200 years later, somebody found an old sword that was tied to a legend of coming from the sky and being the sword of God, which doesn't seem like a big deal until you realize Attila's sword was lost to history and could have ended up with one of his sons and generals, who mostly became part of the different tribes of the area. Tribes like the Scythians and the Sarmatians, who shared the military practices and cultural beliefs with the Huns, which included sacred swords and rituals concerning sacred swords, rituals that they took to Britain when the Romans stationed them there as mercenaries. Rituals that King Arthur may have leaned on, and maybe even a sword that King Arthur may have acquired with the help of these Sarmatians and Scythians. Call me crazy, because I probably am. And I know that this theory doesn't hold a lot of water, but what I can say is that there is at least a chance that this same meteor that came and killed an ancient king, that was worshipped for thousands of years as an object of the gods, was then made into a weapon, which was used to conquer the entire world, that was then brought to Britain, which was then used by King Arthur to forge one of the most important myths that is still influencing everything about the way we tell stories today. Because you can't write about kings or fantasy or swords or weapons without writing a little bit about Excalibur, which in my opinion is the sword from space. Thanks everybody for coming by. I like to make these videos where I create these crazy theories. They're for fun. You can go and check them out and do some historical research on your own. Mostly I want these videos to feel like we're just sitting around a campfire or sitting in our living room just talking about stuff. But I just want to thank you all for coming with me on these crazy adventures, and I hope that I have lightened your day a little bit. I'm obsessed with King Arthur. I'm obsessed with Excalibur, and maybe, who knows, someday that sword will appear once again when the time is right, when the world needs it the most. I'm Levi, and this is Outlandish.